Welcome back to Move with the Sky. Today's episode is going to be about astrology on trial, its transmission, its suppression, as well as how it survived over thousands of years. In episode 4 of Move with the Sky, we laid down the core frameworks that make astrology make sense in the first place. That episode focused on how astrology actually works, not just symbolically, but structurally. We talked about how the horoscope as a snapshot of time worked, how early astrology was for the collective before it became personal, and how the introduction of birth astrology changed everything. That is the examination of the snapshot of the time somebody was born, aka their natal chart. Now, episode 4 also spent time on the ascendant, not just as a technical point, but as the doorway between the sky and the body. Now, that idea became super important for our discussion and it will continue to be as we move forward, because once astrology enters the body, it also entered medicine, psychology, development, aging, and was used in an attempt to answer the question of what it even means to live a human life inside the concept of time. By the 2nd century BCE, astrology was already structurally complete. By that point, the planets, zodiac signs, birth timing, rising sign, and the full natal chart wheel were all integrated. The zodiac became the framework, and the planets became the actors within that framework. We also mentioned in episode 4 how the core question that astrology addressed shifted. It stopped being only what will happen and the question of how does time move. Now that shift is everything, and that's what I plan to focus on extensively in today's episode. Because once astrology began addressing development, health, the temperament of humans, and fate over time, it stopped being just an observational tool and it became a technological advancement. This technological advancement was great at pattern recognition, and it was a way of tracking cycles in the body as well as in cities and in civilizations. Claudius Ptolemy played a central role here. We learned in his work, the Tetrabiblos, he shaped astrology for the next 1500 years. He wrote from a geocentric, meaning earth-centered model. In episode 4, explored Ptolemy's 7 ages of life, where each planetary age reflected stages of the physical and psychological development of us humans. Now, that very framework was very clearly masculine in its observations and assumptions, and that matters too because it showed us the limits of astrology at that time during ancient times, even though the system itself was still considered to be incredibly sophisticated. We also talked about how planetary returns came to be, how they were understood historically, though I've already flagged that as a topic I want to go much deeper into, so that might be in episodes 6 or 7, wherever I find it fits most comfortably and naturally in our discussion here in this podcast. But finally, to finish the recap, episode 4 is interesting too because I introduced you guys to the 4 humors, natal baselines, and we even talked about how certain planets were believed to carry physical qualities, not as metaphors, but as medical observations made by practitioners in that field, where they applied traits or qualities such as hot, cold, moist, or even dry to different planets. Now, these, again, were not symbolic adjectives. They were actually diagnostic tools in medical practice. Episode 4 also had coverage on Mercury's variability and inconsistency, how that played a role in medical timing, when to intervene, when not to intervene, when to choose specific herbs to cure or soothe symptoms, how to track recovery, as well as how temperaments became medical baselines that we still use in language today. Episode 4 essentially talks about the planets, how they rule different bodily symptoms or systems, zodiac signs, how they map the body, as well as the concept of cosmic sympathy. So it's a pretty dense episode, but I suggest that you guys listen to that one first if you haven't already, so that when we get into this deep dive into the history of astrology, how it connected to different religions and all of that, it makes the most sense to you. But yeah, because once astrology began explaining cycles, health, destiny, the rise and fall of cities and civilizations, it really became something that challenged religious monopolies on meaning. So episode 4 ended by bridging astrology into a time-based practice that tracked daily aspects, transits, returns, different timing techniques, and ultimately began working with time instead of fighting it. And that is the pivotal point between episode 4 and what we are about to dive into today. So thanks for listening, and let's see what we are gonna learn next. Originally, I thought episode 5 would be a deeper breakdown of the zodiac signs themselves, but when I looked at my notes, especially from Peter Whitfield's book Astrology, A History, I realized I have almost 40 pages from just one history book alone, covering India, Babylon, Greece, and the systems that eventually shaped Christianity and Islam. Now, that is not something that I wish to rush, so instead of jumping ahead, episode 5 pulls us backwards, back to astrology's origins in Babylonia, back to Greece, back to the Middle Ages, because the signs don't make sense unless we truly understand where they come from. Peter Whitfield structures his book in a way that actually works really well for this podcast. Chapter 1 covers Babylonia, the dawn of astrology. Chapter 2 covers Greece and its perfection of the system, Claudius, Ptolemy, Rome, and the synthesis of earlier traditions. Chapter 3 moves us into the Middle Ages, where we start to see a focus on eclipses, the suppression of astrology even, as well as the re-emergence in the Latin West. And finally, in his book, Chapter 4 covers the Renaissance. And I want to kind of follow that same arc for the podcast, but weave it together with other sources that I'm studying, especially A Scheme of Heaven by Alexander Boxer and Carol Tyrrell's work on applied astrology, which you have heard me mention in previous episodes as well. Now, this isn't about memorizing dates. It's really about understanding the transmission, about respecting the traditions that astrology came from, especially here in the United States, where Western astrology is practiced widely without much historical grounding. So we often lose something important when we skip over where this knowledge comes from. So for me, understanding history helps us understand why different systems work better for different people, and why astrology looks the way it does today in different areas and all of that. So as this podcast continues, I do want to go deeper into chart analysis, persona charts, moon charts, synastry, composite charts, all of that, but that will come later. Before we get there, we need to understand what each ancient civilization actually contributed to astrology. Where did degrees come from? What came from the Greek world? What came from India? What came from the Islamic world? Those distinctions are what truly matter. In fact, they matter even more once astrology starts using transits, returns, and timing techniques, because those tools didn't appear all at once. They actually emerged in specific historical contexts and for specific reasons. So, for episode 5, we're taking it back to Babylonia. Alexander Boxer makes a really sharp observation when he talks about astrology and Christianity side by side. He notes that during the early centuries of the Roman Empire, a handful of disciples wrote down the mystic teachings of an otherwise obscure sect. Those teachings originated in the Near East, but the authors chose to write in Greek and Latin so that they could spread their message as widely as possible. That distinction applies perfectly to Christianity, and interestingly, it also applies to astrology. Astrology, despite claims of being of pure pedigree, is actually what Boxer calls a Roman-era mutt, a hybrid system, a product of cultural mixing. The conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great is actually a turning point here. Babylon falls to Alexander, and that event was believed to have foreshadowed or been foreshadowed by a lunar eclipse, meaning a lunar eclipse happened just before. So, whether or not we accept that interpretation as foreshadowing, what matters is what followed. The march of Alexander's armies kicked off a massive east to west cross pollination across what the Greeks called the Ecumene, the inhabited world. From Egypt to the borders of India, Greek language and Hellenic thought became a shared medium for politics, trade, and ideas in general. And that's why we call this period the Hellenistic period. A lot of what we recognize as astrology today comes directly from this time. There's even cuneiform evidence, tablets dating back to around 410 BCE, showing that astrology was still in its infancy during Alexander's conquests. This system was merely forming as cultures collided. Which brings us to Baghdad. So, in Baghdad, by the year 762, Islam had spread far to the east, and Baghdad now laid at the heart of the Islamic world. Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, the Abbasid Caliph at the time, summoned top astrologers, a Persian and a Jewish man, to determine the optimal moment to inaugurate the construction of this new capital city. Now that detail matters because we've already seen in earlier episodes that timing was significant. Rituals, inscriptions, foundations, these were not random. In fact, they were chosen to align with specific outcomes. And here we see astrology being used at the highest level of political power in an explicitly Islamic context. The horoscope of Baghdad's foundation was preserved by Al-Biruni, one of the greatest astronomers of later centuries. Because of that, we can date the founding precisely to July 30th, year 762 CE. Within just a few decades, Baghdad became the largest city on earth. Commerce flowed in from India, China, Africa, and Europe. This wasn't just a religious center, it was an intellectual engine. And starting with Al-Mansur, the Abbasid Caliphs launched an ambitious program of translating Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic. Under the Caliph Al-Mamun, the focus shifted even more strongly towards the natural sciences. Al-Mamun became the patron of figures like Al-Kindi, known to his contemporaries as the philosopher of the Arabs, and the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi. In his book, the Kitab al-Jabr wal-Mukabula, the book of rectifying and balancing, and I'm sorry you guys for the pronunciation, this book is actually what gives us the word algebra. And under Al-Mamun's enthusiasm for science, the two astronomical observatories were constructed, one in Baghdad and another one in Damascus, or near Damascus. So this time period where all of these things were being built is called the Golden Age. But Boxer makes an important clarification. When we say Arabic science, we're actually talking about the language and not the ethnicity. Just as quote-unquote Greek science included figures like Archimedes from Sicily and Ptolemy from Egypt, many of the great figures of Arabic science were Persian, Jewish, or from elsewhere entirely. So astrology survives here not because it was hidden, but because it was institutionalized in Baghdad. And this is where episode 5 is really meant to start heading. At this point in the story, it becomes clear that astrology is not something that disappears and reappears randomly throughout history. It doesn't vanish and then magically return. What actually happens is quieter and more political. Astrology moves. It migrates when conditions become hostile. It embeds itself where power, education, and translation allow it to survive. It also adapts its language depending on who's in charge of meaning. And this is why it's misleading to talk about astrology as something that was lost in the West during the Middle Ages. What was lost wasn't the knowledge, it was access to it. As Christianity consolidated authority across the Roman Empire and later medieval Europe, astrology increasingly became suspect, not because it didn't work, but because it competed with the theological explanations of fate, providence, and divine will. We saw this tension begin earlier with figures like Origen. Living in ancient Alexandria in the 3rd century, Origen didn't outright reject astrology in the way that later Christian authorities would have, but he struggled deeply with it. He tried to reconcile the observable order of the heavens with Christian free will. He allowed for the stars to signify events, but not to cause them. So that distinction is what becomes crucial. Because once astrology is framed as causative, meaning once it suggests that time itself has a structure, it becomes a rival authority. And rival authorities don't survive alongside or inside monopolies such as Christianity. So in Christian Europe, astrology was slowly reframed. It was absorbed into astronomy. It's tolerated as calculation, but distrusted as interpretation. It survives in monasteries, in medical practice, in agricultural timing, but it loses its public authority. Meanwhile, something very different is happening elsewhere. To understand why astrology flourishes in the Islamic world, especially under the Abbasids, it's helpful to think in more modern terms. If we were to compare it loosely to a modern U.S. government structure, the caliph functioned as both executive authority and an ideological anchor. But knowledge production itself was decentralized and strategic. Scholars were funded. Translation was policy. Science was infrastructure. And this wasn't accidental. When Baghdad was founded in year 762 CE under Al-Mansur, astrology wasn't treated as superstition. It was treated as state technology. The founding of the city itself was timed astrologically. That tells us everything we need to know about how astrology was viewed, not as hearsay, but as intelligence. Under later caliphs like Al-Mamun, this commitment deepened. Translation wasn't about preserving Greek texts for nostalgia. It was about power through pattern recognition. Under later caliphs like Al-Mamun, this commitment deepened, and Masha'allah, Ibn al-Fari was actually one of the figures that began to matter so much. Masha'allah wasn't just an astrologer casting charts for individuals. He was articulating a theory of history, drawing on Persian, Greek, and Indian traditions. He helped formalize conjunction theory, especially the cycles of Jupiter and Saturn, as markers of dynastic change, religious shifts, as well as civilizational rise and fall. In other words, astrology wasn't just personal, it was geopolitical, and that's why it survived here under the Abbasid Caliphate. By the early 9th century, the intellectual climate of Baghdad produces figures like Al-Kindi, often called the philosopher of the Arabs. Al-Kindi's importance can't be overstated, not just for astrology, but for how science itself develops. He didn't reject astrology, he actually systematized it. Al-Kindi argued that the celestial influences operated through rays, measurable, consistent emanations that affected matter. Now, this wasn't mystical thinking. In opposition to science, this was actually early scientific reasoning, cause, effect, transmission. Alongside him was Al-Khwarizmi, whose work gives us the words algorithm and algebra, as I mentioned earlier. Now, that connection matters deeply for this episode because what astrology is doing at this point in history is teaching humanity how to think in cycles, variables, and systems. Patterns, inputs, outputs, and timing. Now, for our modern listener, these things don't seem as rare, but we're talking about thousands of years ago here. Thousands of years ago, when astrology becomes one of the conceptual ancestors of systems thinking itself. And under the Abbasid patronage, this knowledge isn't hidden, it's multiplied. Observatories are built, tables are refined, and the calculations improve. So astrology actually becomes more accurate because astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy are allowed to collaborate with it. This is the opposite of suppression. Now, the Middle Ages. When we return to Europe in what Peter Whitfield calls the Middle Ages, eclipse and reemergence, we need to correct a misconception. Astrology doesn't disappear during the Middle Ages, it just becomes conditional. It survives in medicine, in agriculture, court astrology, in monasteries, in translation centers like those in Spain and even southern France, where Arabic texts are slowly rendered back into Latin. Figures like Guido Bonatti appear later, carrying forward techniques that had never actually died. Again, they had simply been waiting for safer conditions to exist in. And this is why the Renaissance doesn't represent a rebirth from nothing, it represents a re entry for astrology. Astrology comes back into public legitimacy once religious authorities loosens its grip on explanations of nature. And when it does, it brings with it centuries of Islamic, Persian, and Indian refinement that Western narratives often erase. So when astrology is criticized today, framed as irrational, dangerous, or anti scientific, it's worth asking which version of history are we using to make that judgment? Because astrology was once medicine, statecraft, timekeeping, astronomy, and philosophy. It wasn't rejected because it failed, it was challenged because it was competed against. Episode 5 isn't about convincing anyone to believe in astrology either. It's about restoring its memory, showing that it didn't always exist as an embedded way that humans understand themselves. In fact, before anything, it was an embedded way that humans understood time, health, fate, and civilizations as a collective. Now, this sets the stage for what will come next, because in future episodes, when we talk about zodiac signs, aspects, transits, returns, and all of that, we won't be treating them as floating symbols. We'll be able to treat them as the inherited language of thousands of years of human pattern tracking. Astrology didn't survive by accident. It survived because time itself doesn't disappear. So until next episode, continue to move with the sky, and I'll see you there. Bye, y'all.